Let's talk about Firebase Firestore rules. You probably didn't think about it yet, but wasn't it strange that we were able to read and write to this chats collection earlier in this module before we added authentication and users? Put in our words, our Flutter app was able to communicate with this database without an authenticated user. Now, sure, we did connect our app to Firebase, so there is some connection there. But what if I would tell you that technically anyone who knew your project ID, let's say, would be able to talk to your database? Now, of course, knowing your ID is not something that's that easy, but it's definitely not advisable to leave your database open like this. Even if it's hard to find the exact address, it would be possible technically. So instead, you typically want to lock your database down to only your authenticated users. Because then only users who were authenticated with your project, which happens through the Firebase SDK, only such authenticated users are able to write to your database. And as an extra side effect, you then also have a clear trace who wrote what. Now, you can configure something like this through that Rules tab here in the database area. Now, Firestore rules are pretty flexible and also pretty, not complex, but got a lot of features. You can view the official docs to learn all about Firebase rules, and I would strongly recommend that you do so if you plan on using Firebase in your app, because there's a lot you can configure. Basically, every use case is possible. You can configure that some collection is locked down to a specific user, whilst other collections are open to everyone. So there's a lot you can configure, and therefore the official docs are the place to go if you want to use Firebase. This is not a Firebase course, so I will only scratch the surface here. Generally, the rules here are set up here in this Rules tab, and there is an extra little programming language, you could say, the Firebase team invented, which allows you to configure those rules. In the end, rules work like this. You have a match string here, and you can also have nested match strings like this one, which describe the path to which a request was sent, and then the rules that apply for such a request. Now, this is the general request to your database, so you typically leave that unless you know what you want to do. But then you have these nested matches here, which match individual paths inside of your project. So, for example, if we would want to lock down access to this chats collection, and for that I'll open it in a new tab. If I would want to lock down access to this chats collection, I could add a new match here. Let me delete all of that. I could add a new match here where I say, if we target chats, and let me add this here in front of the other match. If we target chats, then a new set of rules should apply. You put your rules for this match between curly braces then. And then a rule is written like this here. You can allow certain kind of access. If you don't match a certain path, by default nothing is allowed. So if I would remove this match, which grants access to all documents in any collection, that's what this means here. If I would delete this, and I would delete this, then everything would be locked down as a default. But of course, then even we with authenticated users wouldn't be able to communicate, because by default it's locked down for everyone, including authenticated users. So I'll bring this back so that we can set this step by step. So here we now have a new match for chats. And after allow, you can define what you want to allow. For example, read and write separated with commas. You could also be more specific and say, I want to allow read and I want to allow creating documents, but deleting and updating would not be allowed. Write, on the other hand, is basically allowing create, update, and delete. So you can't really be very granular here. And then after a colon, you have your condition, when this is allowed. And here, for example, you can access a special request object, which is available here in the rules, where you can access the auth information. And for example, if you say auth unequal to null, you would say if there is some auth information on the request, so if the user is authenticated, if this comes from an authenticated user, Only then such auth information will be on the request. Then I want to allow read and write. So put in other words, unauthenticated users would now not be allowed to read and write. And that's, for example, what I'll now do down there. I will say access to my documents is by default only possible for authenticated users. And as I just said, this here is a special syntax, which means all documents in all collections. It's a wildcard placeholder, so to say. Now, of course, I can delete this extra rule because now we got this more general rule down there. And that is a change that makes sense here, in my opinion. But actually, I don't want to give this general access to everything. I want to be a bit more granular here. And for example, I would say it makes sense that we grant access to users to the user who owns a document, so that not every authenticated user can manipulate any user that's being stored in users. No, you should only be able to edit yourself. So I only want to grant access to users, or let's say I want to grant write access to users, if you are the user with this ID. So you can only edit your specific user document. And that's possible with rules. You can add a new match and say, for the users collection, for user ID, which is of course flexible, there are multiple IDs, you can use such a placeholder, therefore. That basically means for any ID, we now want to have a rule. And there I want to allow writing if request auth unequal null, so if the request comes from an authenticated user, and with the double ampersand symbol here, if request.auth.uid, which is a field that is available on the auth object on the incoming request, is equal to the UID we have here in the path. So you can specify placeholders like this in a path, and you can then reference them in your condition if you want to. And with that, I'm saying only if the incoming request is authenticated and it's authenticated by the user with the user ID of the document I'm trying to edit, only then write access is granted. On the other hand, I'll say users for any user ID. I want to allow read access for any authenticated user. So I'll just check if auth is unequal to null. I don't care if it's the user with the same ID. So the user data can be read by anyone, but only written by the user to whom the ID belongs. That is one possible rule you could set up here. Now again, the official docs dive way deeper than that, but this hopefully gives you a feeling for how this works. And with that, we can also add a new match here, where we target the chats collection, and then any document in there. And for that, I'll again use this special syntax here with the double asterisk. This means any nested collection and or any nested document. For any such document, I want to add a new rule and allow reading by any authenticated user. So if request auth is unequal to null, anyone should be able to read my chats, or any authenticated user should be able to read everything in chats. And in addition, every user should be able to create data in there. For example, new messages. That should be possible for every user here. Now we can always fine-tune this later, but this should be a good start. Now you always need to publish your rules after you edited them. And you can also check if they're right with the rules playground. There you can send dummy requests which don't really edit the database, but basically simulate such an incoming request. And you can simulate get, create, update, and delete requests. You can also simulate that this comes from an authenticated user. And you can also, for example, add extra authentication data like the user ID. That's part of the incoming request. So you can play around with that. You see what will be part of the incoming request that's being simulated. And that should allow you to validate your rules. Now we'll of course also see if those rules fail if we then try to interact with the database, which we're going to do now. With the rules set up, we can now finally continue working on our chat screen here and make sure that we're able to really send chat messages and read them here as well.